Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on this webinar. My name is Lori. I'm here with Dan Hughes. Dan has been working for Nik Software for many years, and then he went to become a professor over at RIT. His current title is Chair Photographic Sciences Undergraduate Program Director at Rochester Institute of Technology. So he's all about photography. He is probably one of the most well-versed person as far as knowing everything there is to know about Nik software and the Nik Collection, since he's been working with it for so long. And it was my pleasure to work with him then. And now he's doing webinars for us, so it's very exciting. So he's going to go ahead and take you through some landscape images using Viveza, and I'm going to go ahead and let Dan explain what he's going to be talking about. Sit back and enjoy, and thanks, Dan, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Lori. That was a really lovely introduction, and I appreciate it. I don't know if I'm the most knowledgeable, but I use the software a lot, been using it a long time, and kept up to date as DxO has been doing a really nice job updating this stuff. In fact, there's a lot of really cool new features within Viveza 3 for anyone who hasn't been using it or maybe hasn't started playing with some of the newer tools and the new interface within Viveza 3. And maybe some of you are brand new into the Nik collection, in which case this webinar should be for everyone. We're going to talk about, I'm going to show some landscape images. We're going to talk about bringing light and details out using Viveza 3's global adjustment tools and the localized adjustment tools, so we can go into particular areas and onto particular objects and manipulate the image, adjust the light and color, potentially to bring out what was, more realistic in the scene, or potentially control the viewer's attention in a photograph a little bit, to inform the viewer of the image exactly where to look. Right, we can kind of control the attention of the viewer of a photo with a few sort of simple rules, and then some tactics and tools to kind of optimize the photo. This slide just kind of walks us through some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. Long story short, we're going to get into control points. And control points are a really great and easy way to control and manipulate light and color using Viveza 3. Without having to worry about layers, layer masks. And it's a really, once you get used to using control points, it's a really kind of ergonomic tool. You just point at an object and then you're able to control the brightness level or the contrast or the color and so on. So that's what we're talking about today. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be using Viveza 3 from Photoshop, just launching from Photoshop. It doesn't really matter what host software you're using or whether you're on a Mac or a PC. Almost everything that we're going to talk about today is relevant to you, whether you're, again, a Mac or PC user, somebody launching from Photoshop or Lightroom or Photolab or wherever you might be working from. So we've got our first image here, and I'm going to open into Viveza 3 using this Nik selective tool. For anyone not familiar, this is one of the couple of ways that you can access the Nik plugins from Photoshop. We can talk a little bit about that if anybody has any questions about it later on, or Lori might be able to point you in a direction if you ask a question now. Now, I'm going to click on Viveza 3, and Viveza will launch, and we will get a really lovely interface. Mine has got a dark tone to it, and I want to walk us through the interface before we jump into the tool set. Again, I know we have a wide swath of folks here, from experts that have been using these tools for a long time to folks who've maybe never even seen the interface before. So I want to make sure that everybody's comfortable once we get into the tools themselves. So you can see my cursor here over our main image preview that shows up in the middle. If you follow my cursor over to the left-hand side, this is where the presets are kept. Presets are sort of predetermined instructions for the tools that you see over on the right-hand side of the interface. And we'll talk about all of these different tools over on the right. But let's cover these presets. And note that you can actually save your own presets as well. And that's where I find the most use within Viveza's presets. Several of these I've used on different images, But I find that using Viveza 3, I prefer to create my own looks, generally because it's such a specific tool to use, meaning, every image is a little bit different in terms of light and color. All of the images maybe will use control points in different places, but don't let that stop you. And don't let that stop you from just clicking to see the potential that your image could have just by clicking a single time. Like if I click on the darkened preset here, 005 darkened preset. First of all, anytime you click on a preset, you're going to get a warning saying, okay, if you're going to use a preset, it's going to reset the tools that are over there on the right-hand side. It's just letting you know. Once you recognize that, you can actually click this little checkbox here where it says don't show again, and that prompt is not going to show up again. For me, I leave it on, so it might get a little bit annoying for us over the webinar, and I leave it on just so I don't have to mess with my preferences every time we open up for these webinars. I want you guys to sort of see what's going to happen maybe the first time you ever launch. Anyways, I'm going to click the yes button. You're going to see the image darken down, and now we have some really nice densities. Now, we might not want to use this, and that's totally fine. But the beauty of these presets is that you get a good idea what your image would look like with these different sets of adjustments. So the adjust sky, number 10, 010, adjust sky, actually implements the use of some control points right in the preset. So it's assuming that our sky is in the top of the frame, which it generally is, of course, and it's actually going in and making some adjustments for us. They're predetermined, but again, it's useful for being able to click just one time and to get some idea of some potential as to what could happen. I have a couple of my own custom presets. I'll just click into those really quickly. Some of mine are really funky and weird. This is a color infrared emulation, which is actually part of a combination of tools that I would use if I was trying to sort of make a false infrared image from a visible color image. Anyways, I will create these myself. This is bleach bypass with sky control points, right? So this is the idea here is a high contrast, sort of low saturation with lots of texture in sky. I don't think it works well for this image, but you can kind of get a sense of at least what I use custom presets for. In this case, it's to kind of create that overall look within a single click, because I've already done the work in Lightroom once before to create this bleach bypass kind of look. I might as well just save it as a preset, so anytime I want to get it, I can. And let's say I like the bleach bypass look, but I decide that these control points are not usable. We're going to focus today a lot on control points, but for now, let's say we don't like them. Well, you just click on the control point and then tap the delete key on your keyboard, and it should get rid of it for you. In my case, and I just updated this morning, and maybe I got something going on there. Now, when I try to delete control points, I'm getting a little prompt that comes up behind my interface. It's a little bit strange, but in this case, because we're going to be deleting control points throughout the webinar, I'm actually going to turn this prompt off. So I'm going to click delete now. And it's just a warning to make sure that we know that we're deleting those control points. Now that I've gotten rid of that prompt, it should just work for us. All right, let's go back into our presets. I'm going to scroll back up to the top here, and we're just going to reset. We're going to go to neutral. So the presets are a really great way to work in a very quick method. And again, in my sort of personal view, it's a great starting point, or it's a great place to see the potential of some different looks. For now, though, because I want to cover the interface, I'm just going to hide our presets, the whole left side of the interface. There's a little triangle there. If I click on it, it'll just hide the presets or that whole window. And that's going to allow us to get a little bit more real estate for our image. Now, we will, and we're going to talk about the top toolbar in a couple minutes. I'm going to actually skip over it right now because there are a bunch of before and afters, and then zoom sort of ratios and zoom percentages, and we haven't done anything to the image, so there isn't much to kind of demonstrate using those tools right now. So if you follow me up to the upper right corner, we'll get into the loop and the histogram, and then we'll kind of go from there. So in the far upper right hand corner is our loop, And the idea or function of the loop is to kind of follow your cursor around as you move through the image. And it shows a full resolution representation of your image. You can actually see from where I was on a ferry crossing from the New York side of Lake Champlain over to Vermont. And at the time, there was quite a lot of atmospheric haze. So I'm getting a little bit of that showing up in that loop. But long story short, the loop is going to follow your cursor around, and you're going to get your 100% or full resolution representation. Now, if you don't want to see the loop, you can, of course, click on the twirler or this little expand collapse triangle. Click on that, it'll close it. And underneath the loop, you have a live histogram. The live histogram has a really nice way of toggling through your RGB values, red, green, and blue, and then your individual red, green, blue, and luminosity channels. So as you are interested in keeping an eye on those kinds of values, the brightness levels of your different colors and your luminosity, you can do that. You can, of course, just click on whichever one. So I can click on the blue channel or the red channel, or you can literally click in the histogram and it will toggle through for you. There's also a clipping capability that will show you, it will show or hide whether you've got details that are clipping. Right now, I don't think we have any details that are clipping. So as I click on them to turn them on, you're not going to see any of that facet happening, except maybe, oh, maybe in the very top of this silo right here, you can actually see it a little bit, that little black spot there. Well, I'll exaggerate that in a minute, and we can take a look at what's happening there. So underneath the histogram are our global adjustments, right? And in fact, let's kind of run through what we can see on screen right now for our adjustment tools. You have a global adjustment tool. You have a selective tones tool, which will also technically be adjusting the global values of the image. It's just the selective tones will break into the highlights, the brightest values. Your midtones, which would be grays, the tones that are not so bright, but also not very dark. Your shadows, which are the darker values in the image, and then the black tones, which are the very darkest values within the photograph. These sliders, though, if you were to adjust one, if you bring, highlights to the left or highlights to the right, what's happening is Viveza is looking for those particular brightness values and allowing us to manipulate them. Dragging highlights to the left will darken it, dragging it to the right will brighten it. More on that in a little bit. Underneath selective tones, we have a white balance tool. Now, for the most part, I find myself adjusting the white balance for corrective purposes within a RAW processor. So within Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom's develop module or Photolab in the white balance tool, specifically because I'm shooting RAW, and I would typically suggest that for most people. There might be workflows where maybe you don't want to, and that's fine. In which case, if you're shooting JPEG, you could hypothetically white balance in camera, and then also here. I find this white balance tool to be handy when I'm wanting to do any kind of creative color balance adjustment. But it's really lovely to have a white balance adjustment tool built into the Nik plugins, and we have it right here within Viveza. So it's nice that it's here. I just find myself only using it for creative purposes. When you want to use the white balance adjustment tool, you must click the little checkbox that's to the left of the label, click it on so that checkbox is there. And then, of course, you have a temperature slider, and then you have a color picker. And the color picker, if you were to click on that, allows you to go into a neutral tone and choose that as your gray value. So if I go and click on one of my gray values, I can go and create a different color balance within the image. Like I said, I will typically use this for creative purposes. I don't think I'd ever click on the red of the barn here, because then I'm going to get this very cyan image, this blue image that's literally cyan. That's not going to work for me for the most part. One thing that is happening here, though, is that because I still have my histogram highlight clipping illuminator on, you are now getting an idea of some of the values that, because of the adjustments that I made, are now blown out, that is without detail. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and just turn this off, and that's going to remove the adjustment, but it's in there, it's handy, it's a global adjustment, and it's a nice tool to have built somewhere into the Nik plugins, and it's here within Viveza. So with that, let's just jump back up into our global adjustments. I'm going to just add a little bit of global contrast here. I'm going to remove my indicators as well. And from there, I'm going to also just take my highlights down a little bit, and I'm going to reduce my shadow tones just a touch. So what I'm doing now is I've increased the overall contrast with the contrast adjustment slider. It is a global adjustment, which just means it's affecting everything within the image. It's global. And then I went into my selective tones and adjusted my highlights and my shadows. So now if we move up into the compare section up here in the middle upper left portion of the interface, that's the confusing part. So if you move into the top left quadrant of the interface with my cursor here, and we look at the compare button, when you press and hold the compare button, you'll see the before, and as I let go of the compare button, I'll see the after, right? And really what we've done here is just a contrast adjustment, and then went into our selective tones with highlights and shadows and sort of manipulated that to get a more full range of values, right? So if we were to reset our adjustments and look at our histogram, you would notice that the original histogram in the image, before we manipulated these tones, it was a little bit gray. It was the tones were, there's nothing that was completely black, and there's nothing that was really white. And by making just these three adjustments with contrast, highlights, and shadows, we now have a sort of more robust set of tones overall, right? So there's more impact overall. Now, the other thing that I'd want to do to this image, in my mind anyways, is go in and selectively adjust the clouds to get a little bit more dimension, therefore kind of controlling the viewer's attention in the image, right? So if we step back and kind of look at our photograph, we've got in the foreground, this area here, just, you know, some not large waves, but a little bit of chop on the lake. But it acts as a nice sort of foreground element and line that separates our middle ground, where we've got our farm, and then into the background where there's the Adirondack Mountains, and then up into the sky, right? And if we look at the before and after using that compare button just one more time, our initial global adjustments give us a little bit more impact overall, but I want to drive it home by creating a little bit more impact in the clouds. The exposure here allows us to do that because we've captured our shadow details and we've captured our highlight details. And now by moving into the selective adjustment section here on the right side, which by the way, if you missed that, the interface looked like this a minute ago. And what I did was I just scrolled down. So there's actually a scroll bar on the right, and we can scroll up and down, or because I'm on a laptop, I can just use my trackpad and I can, you know, scroll up and down the way that this Mac laptop allows me to do that. So from there, we've got our access to our control points. And to use a control point, you literally just click on this button here where it says plus, and it's got a little icon of a control point. We move over into our image, and we literally just click to drop the point on the object that we want to adjust. Now, there's a few different techniques that we're going to talk about using these control points. The first one is we're just going to go ahead and encompass the entire sky with this one point, right? So I'll just go stick it kind of in the middle. I don't really want to put it on the darkest value in the clouds, and I don't really want to put it on the very lightest value in the clouds when using this technique where I kind of want the entire sky to be affected by the control point. I want to find a kind of middle tone in the object that I've placed it on. So thankfully, right in the center of the image on this particular sky, we're able to get a good selection. And I'll show you some of these selections in a little bit. But basically, we're going to be able to manipulate the sky by literally just telling the control point where to go. So by clicking and placing the point on the object that we want, and then sizing this circle, which by the way, the circle, this is called an area of influence. It isn't going to make a circular selection for us in this case, but it is going to make a selection inside of the circle. Because I want to enhance the entire sky, I'm going to encompass the entire sky with this particular technique, with the one control point. And then I'm going to scroll down. So follow me back over to the right side of the interface. We've placed our control point. You can see it's listed here, control point number 1. I'm going to rename this to be just sky. So to rename a control point, you just double click on the point in your control points list and you can rename it. It's one of these new nice features within Viveza. And then we're going to scroll down, and any of the adjustment sliders that you find below the control point tool are going to control or adjust that point, right? So meaning any of these tools that are underneath the control points, as I adjust them, will only be affecting the stuff that the control point is controlling, right? So in this case, as I move into this structure slider and I start to bring out some of the structure within the clouds, a little bit of texture here, maybe increase a little bit of contrast, now we're getting a little bit more oomph out of our clouds. I can easily take my structure up too high, although maybe that's appropriate in some different images. I think that it doesn't work as well for this photograph. I think it just starts to look a little bit out of balance. So I'm going to start to just dial my structure back a little bit, maybe put this at about 40% or 50%, and then maybe even go into our color sliders, and let's take the warmth and let's just remove a little bit of warmth, which is going to cool the sky down just a touch. So now with this one control point that we've placed in the sky, encompassed the entire area that we want to adjust, we've added a little bit of contrast, added a little structure, which is going to enhance the texture in the image, and then brought the warmth down, cooling those clouds down just a little bit. And if we look at a new before and after, actually a different before and after, the split preview in this case, so if you follow my cursor into that upper left quadrant where the compare button is, now when I click on the side-by-side preview, you can see on the left is the original image, and on the right is the image where our control point as well as our global adjustments are going in and helping us to adjust the photo. Now, if we had, and we do have a lot more time in the webinar, but if we had more time overall, because I want to get into the next image, I think what I would do is place some control points in our middle ground here and manipulate the color just a little bit, because I think this control point is actually adjusting into the middle ground a little. If you ever want to see what a control point is adjusting, you move into your selective adjustment section on the right side where your control points are listed, and you actually just click on the little box. So here's our sky point label. To the right of it, there's a little box that has it's a rectangle with a circle in it. And if you click on that, you can see the selection that this control point is making. Now, the way that you would read this is that anything that is white is being controlled and adjusted by this point. Anything that's black is not going to be affected by this point. So like the darker values within the trees in the foreground, maybe some of the darker shadow areas in the very foreground of the water there, they're not being affected much, if at all. But some of these other areas are, just a little bit. And you can see that, again, by clicking this little toggle on and off. So it's the square with the circle in it, or the rectangle that has a little circle in it on the right side. But you can actually also control how the control point makes its selection. In fact, this is one of the newest tools that's built into Viveza 3, and it's the ability to be able to control exactly what the control point is masking. So we're able to actually, enable this control point a little bit better by affecting the color selectivity with the luminance slider and the chrominance slider. I'm going to explain that a lot more in the next image. But for the sake of our time and for the sake of getting into a couple different photographs, I'm just going to click the apply image in the lower right corner, the apply button, that is. Oh, you know what? Before we do that, let's save this as a preset. So let's say we love this effect. It's a relatively straightforward adjustment with the contrast that we've added globally, and then the one control point. So if we click the Save Preset button in the lower right corner here, we're able to then, all of my prompts seem to be coming up behind my interface. That's a little bit funky. So I'm going to name this Global Contrast with Sky Structure. And then that new preset with the checkpoint, or this checkbox on, Save with Control Points, making sure that's on because I'm using a control point. I'm going to click the Save button. That new preset is going to be saved into our custom presets that you can find over here on the left side. So generally, when you open the software, you will be within the presets section you can see in the upper left corner. We just saved a new custom preset, so we're going to see that here, Global Contrast with Sky Structure. There's a lot to it. It's nice. All right, so let's click the Apply button. Let's keep moving. I want to talk more about control points. I want to tell you how to control them more, a couple different kinds of techniques, specifically how to use that luminosity and chrominance slider that allows you to manipulate the selection that the control point is actually making. So let's keep moving. Yeah, let's jump into this image. So we'll open Viveza. And then, of course, the first thing that we're going to do as we launch into any tool is we're going to assess the image. We're going to kind of figure out, what are the areas that we want to manipulate? Where are the areas that we want to kind of control the viewer? In this image, it's a relatively, straightforward and simple photograph. This is from Zion National, no, sorry, not Zion National Park. It's not even, it's relatively close, but it's, Arches National Park. And I'm sure there are folks out there who can tell me the exact part of the park that we're looking at. And I should know, I've been there several times, but for some reason it escapes me right now. Anyways, we've got a relatively straightforward image. We've got some sandstone here in the foreground, red rock in the foreground, and we've got our sky in the background. And this is a great opportunity for us to talk about how control points are making their selections and how we can, in a very nuanced way, control the viewer's attention and the overall result of our dodging and burning, or our color manipulation through the image. So first thing we're going to do, I'm going to close down global adjustments on the right side in white balance. And also, I'm just going to close levels and curves, which is a really nice feature to have in here. Hopefully, we'll be able to talk about levels and curves because I want to dive into our control points here. We're going to click on the Add Control Point button, and let's just place a point in the sky. All right, and let's look at the selection that control point is making right now. So we have our active control point. I know that the point over here in our image is active because it's glowing gold, or not glowing, but it is a gold sort of orange tone. If I place another control point here within our red rock, you'll see that now that I've placed this new point, it's glowing gold or has this orange tone to it. And control point number 1 is now white, right? So I guess what I'm getting at there is, a point is active if it's gold, and also you can see the area of influence around it. We will adjust these areas of influence as we go. But for now, let's click onto control point number 1 within our control point list. Let's double click on the type, and let's just name this sky, control point, if I could type, control 1, sky control 1. Cool. Let's look at that selection. So if you follow my cursor over to that the little rectangle with the circle in it, and you click on that, this is indicating to us that we are controlling this area primarily right in here in these tones. You can see how there's this nice kind of gradation outward. So it's this soft, very photographic looking selection. And that's, in my mind, the benefit of these control points is that they create a very photographic looking selection. Therefore, when you adjust the light and color, the result is photographic looking, as opposed to maybe a more graphic tool, like literally cutting something out, which is great. It's a really nice way of working, being able to have let's say a brush or a lasso tool or whatever. But in this way, we get these very photographic looking results, literally, again, just by placing a point and then placing it on the tone and color that we want. If we move the control point around, you can see as the mask sort of automatically updates itself. And what you'll notice is that it's doing a great job to understand that we just want the control point to affect the blue of the sky, right? The clouds and the blue. If we take our point and we drag it over to our rock, you can see that the control point does a nice job to make a selection of those tones, colors, and textures, right? In this case, we're going to place the control point right there on the rock, on the sky, and we're going to expand our area of influence out. Now, as we expand the area of influence, what happens is we're sort of creating a more broad selection overall, right? As we adjust this, you can actually start to see some of the rock is going to be adjusted with this particular control point right now. There are two ways around that. Well, there's three ways around it. One way is to just size the area of influence to be smaller, right? So that maybe we're only affecting in there. And as we make that smaller, the control point makes a little bit more of a specific sort of selection. It's as if the radius or the tolerance that the control point is looking for is smaller. But here's the trick. There's a bunch of different ways of working like this as well. If we expand the control point out, maybe let's go a little bit smaller than this, and then we'll ultimately take this exact same point and place it over here in a couple minutes. But let's say this point is doing basically what we want it to, except it's affecting in the rock a little bit. Here's how you can clean this up. And there's two ways, but here's how you can clean it up using this new color selectivity tool. First of all, we're of course viewing the selection right now. We turn that on with the control points list. And then if you scroll down a little bit into the color selectivity sliders, the luminance and the chrominance sliders are going to be set to 50% by default. If you take your luminance slider and you start sliding it to the right, what's happening is we are lowering the tolerance. So we're telling the control point to only affect the brightness values, the luminance, so how bright or dark the thing is, into a sort of smaller tolerance. So the further to the right this slider goes, the fewer brightness levels the control point is going to select. So this is one of the ways of making our selection more precise. If you slide the luminance slider to the left, now we're telling this software, we're telling the control point specifically that any values that are in this wider breadth of tolerance should be controlled as we make our adjustments with our control point sliders. So what you want to do is, and I would suggest, probably rarely taking this luminance slider or the chrominance slider all the way over to the right or all the way over to the left, mostly because the selection becomes, or oftentimes becomes, less photographic looking. So what I like to do personally is sort of find this nice delicate balance between the selection looking photographic, meaning like there's nice transitions and I'm controlling the tones and values that we want, between both the luminance and the chrominance. Now let's talk a little bit about chrominance. If I take my chrominance slider to the right, it's doing the same thing as that luminance slider, except it's looking for color specifically, right? So if luminance is the brightness value, so how white or dark or how bright or dark the value is, the chrominance is going to be the color value itself. So sliding it to the right, we get more specific, and sliding it to the left, it broadens out into other colors. So finding a balance is going to be useful. Here's the caveat to that. 60 or 70% of the time, I don't even touch these sliders personally because I find that the control points make the selections that I need them to make. Only sometimes am I going to go in with these sliders and actually have to manipulate them to get exactly what I want. And the key is kind of less so paying attention to what this selection is doing, right? So actually paying attention to the white and black selection, and more so paying attention to when I make my adjustments, is it affecting anything I don't want it to affect? Right, so adding that extra bit of control and being able to, with nuance, just adjust very slightly my luminance and chrominance color selectivity, my control points, is just this wonderful add-on that we didn't have before. So it's really wonderful to have this added bit of control. So what we're doing here is we've made our very sort of specific selection with the control point, and I've gone in and added a little contrast, saturation, and structure. I want to get the exact same adjustment over in this part of our sky. So what we're going to do is duplicate this control point. There's a few ways of doing that. First of all, if you click on this control point, you can tap Command C, Command V, and that's going to give us another control point. Or in the way that I typically or prefer to do it is I just hold the Option key down and drag away. So let me rephrase that. If I want to duplicate this control point, I'll hold the Option key on my Mac. I believe that's Alt on a PC. While I'm holding down Option, I click on the control point that I want to duplicate and I drag. And this is going to give us an exact duplicate of our control point, so we can kind of go off and put it wherever we need it to be. And then maybe just look at the selection with that sky control point to make sure that we're getting what we want. I'm happy with it. All right, let's talk a little bit more about nuance. So within our red rock here, we've got a couple different values. You can see the light is hitting the rock in different places at different values. There's some shadow here. There's some different textures in here. So this area compared to that area. There's some darker tones here. And what we're going to do is sort of just subtly manipulate these different areas, again, to help direct the viewer's attention through the image, right? In the long run, our goal, usually in a photograph, is to arrest our viewer, so stop them so that they look at the image, and then attempt to keep their attention, through the use of all facets of photography: composition, lighting, exposure, focus, depth of field, all that stuff, right? It's all important. And then, the next steps are to be able to utilize these kinds of tools like Viveza to, whether it's in a relatively extreme or highly manipulative way, attract the viewer's eye and direct the viewer's eye with contrast and tone, or maybe in a very subtle way, direct the viewer's attention, maybe by just shifting some colors here or there, right? Even if it's subtle. So let's talk about this. I've placed a point on this part of our red rock here. It's a little bit cooler and a little bit darker than some of the other parts. And first of all, I want to make sure that my control point is making the selection I want. So let's go into there. We'll turn on our selection. And then let's make this a little bit more precise. And then let's start with chrominance. And then let's maybe move into the luminance slider just a touch. Or yeah, let's do that. Now, again, I want to be relatively subtle with my color selectivity, because I think if I take it too far, it can be fantastic if I'm being very subtle to make a selection that's this precise, right? But oftentimes I want to kind of give the control point a little bit of wiggle room. And I don't want to say by being less precise, but by being a little bit more general with these sliders, I found it makes for a better overall adjustment. It just looks better typically. So I will typically back these sliders down a little bit. But now you can see, if I move this control point around, it's a pretty precise selection of those slightly different values, right? And then if we want to take it one step further, we can take another control point. I'm going to turn off this selection. I'm going to take another control point though, place it in here, and then let's go back to control point number 4's selection. Oops, sorry, that was the wrong one. I need to go to control point number 2. And what I've done with this control point number 5, and this is where it's not necessarily complicated, but we have to get sort of used to what these control points do. The more control points you add, the more precise each control point gets, right? So by adding in control point number 5 here, this control point is control point number 2, one that's highlighted, is not going to be affecting these areas so much. So let's turn this off. Let's make this selection a little bit more precise. And once I'm pretty happy with the result of these 2 control points, I'm going to make some overall adjustments to them. And then I'm going to start duplicating them into some different areas. And then what we'll ultimately get is a little bit of what's called checkerboarding. So I've clicked on our control point that's in this sort of darker and a little bit cooler area. We're going to add in some structure. I love what happens with the structure tool, which is enhancing some of the texture in there. And then we're going to go into the blue slider, right? So built into our basic adjustments, you have brightness, contrast, saturation, structure, the ability to adjust the shadows, which are, again, those sort of darker values, but built into these sets of sliders as well. And then you've got warmth. Slide the warmth slider to the left, it's going to warm it. Slide it to the right, it's going to cool. Right? We're not going to take it that far, but you can probably get a sense of what I'm going to do here. We've got red, green, and blue sliders, as well as hue. And one of my favorite things to do in a nuanced way, in a slight way, is to control the viewer's attention, is I will subtly attempt to cool and warm slightly different areas within the image. So by adding in blue and by removing a little bit of red, what we're getting here is almost like we're desaturating, but we're actually cooling down some of this rock here. And therefore, with this control point, we're able to either leave it alone or in a relatively subtle way, maybe add the opposite. So we'll add like a little bit of red, add a little bit of structure. And I think I've actually taken this point a little bit too far, which is relatively easy to do. But now we have more separation between this rock and this texture rock, right? And if we want to exaggerate that / bring it to the rest of the image, we can go in and duplicate our points. So again, by holding the Option key on our keyboard, hold Option, click and drag. I can go and place duplicate control points of the ones that are kind of cooling and reducing the overall saturation, basically, and maybe even darkening these different values to sort of attract or push away the viewer's attention. Right? We could do the same thing with our warming control points. So I'm going to duplicate this point into some of this texture. Had you asked me while I was in Arches, I could have remembered and recalled exactly why those textures are different. It has something to do with the microbiome on the rock and then its oxidation. And I don't recall the specifics, and it's sad because it's a really interesting phenomenon that happens. But anyways, if you haven't been to Arches National Park in the desert southwest of the United States, I would definitely suggest all of those parks if you could possibly go when it's appropriate. All right, so long story short, we're using a bunch of control points here. The idea, though, was to bring out a little bit of tone and texture in the sky, and then in a relatively subtle way, cool some of the textures, and I've darkened a little bit of them, and then warmed some of the textures within the rock. And by doing this in a 10% here and a 15% over there kind of way, in the overall scheme of things, we get a very different photograph, right? So I clicked on our third and final kind of view. So in the upper left quadrant here, I clicked on what's called side-by-side preview. Right now it's on top of each other. But if we click on side-by-side and I tap the Tab key on my keyboard, I can hide the tools so that we can get a better sense of what's happening. On the left is the original image, and on the right is the enhanced image, where we're using these control points with this method of subtle adjustments here and there to really create a lot more depth and pop. And I think the things that I've done to the image are maybe a little bit more than I would want to, like if I were to make a print of this photograph, but I think it holds up pretty well for the webinar. One of the things that I run into for the webinars is I need to make an adjustment that's sort of strong enough where you're going to see what's happening without taking it too awful far. Anyways, control points, they're lovely. They're easy to use once you get used to them, and you can just place a point and make the adjustment happen, or you can get into these kinds of nuanced techniques where you're controlling each one individually and directing the viewer's attention through the image. I'm going to click the apply button. It's 4:47. I've got at least one more image where I want to just give you a couple more little examples of how to use these control points. Let's skip that one. That one's almost the same. Let's jump into this one. This is actually kind of a harder image to start to manipulate because the way that it's been captured is already somewhat stylized, right? In this case, this is a panoramic image that was shot with a tilt shift lens to create this kind of miniature effect of the Golden Gate Bridge. Let's jump into Viveza. And the idea here is to sort of attract the viewer's attention towards the areas that we want the viewer to look and push the viewer's attention away from the areas where we don't want the viewer to look, or at least pay much attention to. The first thing that kind of screams at me is in the lower left corner of the frame, we have some corrective adjustments to make. That is, this area here, it's completely out of focus. It's not like really blurred, but it's completely out of focus. And it's relatively high contrast. So in my opinion, this becomes a little bit distracting, almost heavy on the left side of the frame. So what we'll do is just jump right in with the control point, place the point on the brightest value there, and then just move into our brightness. Actually, let's not. Let's move all the way down into our selective tones, because of course we're dealing with our control point, but we also have these selective tone adjustments, and I can start to bring those values down just in the highlights. So mind you, I'm going to double click on the highlight slider here. If I take the brightness slider down, it's going to darken down that whole area that the control point is making a selection of. And that works for us, and that's great in a lot of situations. But one of the beauties of this new tool, the selective tones, is that we're able to place the point on the object that we want to adjust and then take our highlights down. And therefore, now we are reducing sort of some of those distracting elements, being that it was very high contrast due to the fact that those highlights were bright. And now, if you sort of sit back in your chair a little bit, that lower left corner isn't as distracting. It doesn't pull your attention in like it did before with the original tonal values. So let's keep moving. Add a control point. This section of the image is relatively sharp. Let's actually zoom in. I don't think I've even covered these. So your zoom features here, pretty straightforward. It doesn't hurt anything to just click on this stuff, but these are your zoom features. Fit to screen just fits within our window here. Fill screen is going to fill our window here, our image window. And then you have a nice little navigator that you can sort of move around. Then you have one-to-one, which is a default setting, which will zoom us all the way into 100%, which in this case, because it's a panoramic, it zooms way in because it's relatively high resolution. You can also see it wasn't terribly sharp, but that's okay. Then the last feature that I want to show you here with the zoom is that you can actually choose the ratio that you'd like to be zoomed into. So these first two here, 2-to-1 and 3-to-1, they're going to zoom you in past 100%. They're going to zoom you in past the full resolution. Whereas if you go to 1-to-2 or 1-to-3 or 1-to-4, that's going to zoom you to those ratios. So in this case, 25% that we're looking at. We're looking at technically 25% of the frame, right? Or 25%, not 25% of the frame, sorry, 25% resolution, right? Now, I'm going to go back to fill. I like being able to see a lot of the image here. I'm happy with our result. And we're just going to go in and add a little bit of structure. Brings out some of the texture in that area that should be in focus. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of warmth to that area in the image. And I think I want to do the same kind of adjustment to the Golden Gate Bridge, which, you know, I think if you were to really look at this photograph, if a student were to hand this in into one of my classes as is, I would say, cool, that's a fun use of the sort of miniature facet of using a tilt shift lens on a digital camera here, but nothing's actually in focus. So what we need to do if we want, you know, happens from time to time, what we need to do if we want to really direct the viewer's attention is play with some of the graphic elements within the image and bring out the values that are going to help to direct the viewer's attention through the image. So this part of the bridge here, this upright here, was a little bit cool and blue. So I added contrast and I added a little bit of red with our color sliders. Maybe we'll even add a little structure. And what that's going to do is help to kind of call out those areas within the image a little bit more than they were before. Because they're not really sharp, we just have to pay attention to how those values separate, how the brightness and the dark tones sort of separate from each other to, again, sort of distract from areas where we don't want the viewer to be paying attention, and to direct the attention towards the areas where we do want the viewer to pay attention. I love how this line it's sort of a gradiated line because of the boat coming through with the wake. It works nicely in my opinion here, but it doesn't move your eye into anything with a lot of texture, right? So what we're going to do here is place a control point in that sort of lower portion of quadrant of the frame. We're going to add in a little extra saturation. I'm going to remove red, which is going to add cyan, and then I'll just add a little bit of structure as well. And again, trying to work it, if we add too much structure, it becomes blatant, right? And that's great in some situations, but looks weird here because almost nothing is actually sharp. So I'm going to just add a little bit of structure to sort of attract your eye as the viewer into that area within the image. And then, it wouldn't hurt to just duplicate that and see if there are other parts of the photo that could help, that could, aid in the distraction or the attraction of the viewer's attention through the image. One last image here, or one last control point here before we sort of transition into a Q&A, because I've kind of chalked this hour full, more so than intended, but we had a lot to talk about. I'm just going to go and cool off our sky just a touch, at least at the very top. And then we're going to place another control point closer to the horizon. Oops, need that one. And the reason I want to place this one closer to the horizon is we're creating this kind of checkerboarding effect, which in general is usually used with luminosity, so that is the brightness of the area within the image. But by darkening and adding saturation up here, and then even just removing a little bit of saturation here, it goes highly saturated and a little bit darker to less saturated, a little bit lighter, and then maybe even another point down here and darkening that down just a touch by placing a point and then using the, let's use the midtones just to darken those values a little bit. And we're creating this, again, kind of checkerboarding effect, which is light to dark, or in this case, dark to light to dark. And what that's going to help us to do is distract or attract the viewer's attention through the image. All right, Lori, I'm going to hit the OK button on this one, or the apply button down here in the lower right. We'll take a look at the before and after in Photoshop, and let's transition to a couple questions. I actually meant to do that a few minutes ago, but wanted to show off a couple more control point kind of capabilities.
Cool. Stephen said that arches image is
Yes.
called Wall Street arches.
Yes.
Wall Street.
Wall Street.
Okay.
Thank
Great.
you. That's much appreciated, Stephen.
Millie is asking, what is the difference between using shadow versus selective tones?
Got it, because there's two different shadow sliders. This is a large image that's processing out. I clicked the apply button, so it's still working away right now on my poor little laptop. I'll try to display the difference. They have a very similar intention. So let's go to this photo and open up Viveza, and I'll point out what the question is specifically, or at least I'll try to, Lori, and then we'll talk about it, because it's a good eye. Lori, who mentioned that? I'm sorry.
Millie.
Got it. Millie?
Millie? Yeah.
Oh, yep, very good. Millie, good eye. So Millie's pointing out the fact that in both the global adjustments as well as in the selective tones, there's a shadow and shadows slider. Now, okay, let's back up for a second. In previous versions of Viveza, there was a shadow slider, this slider. And then as DxO updated the tools, DxO added selective tones, highlights, midtones, and shadows, right? In my mind, they are doing almost the same thing, except in the selective tones, your tolerance or your maximum adjustment is a little bit more, right? If you take this shadow slider all the way down to -100, you're going to see those darker values go really dark. Whereas, and I haven't made a test image to actually look to see exactly what it's affecting, but as we slide these around, you can see shadows here. It's a little bit more subtle. It's taking the dark values, darkening them down a little bit. And then here in the selective tones, the shadow slider takes them much further. I believe this was done because shadow was already an algorithm and slider / tool built into Viveza. And when they made the newest version and updated with the selective tones, it only made sense if you're going to have highlights and midtones and blacks to also at least have shadows here. And so they've included that. Now, I should actually make an image. You can make test targets basically that show you your different values. And I could see we could make it a sort of scientific approach and actually look to see what each one is doing. But, you know, right off the bat, we can see that this shadow slider it's probably likely affecting slightly different tones because each one of these sliders is moving into a section of the histogram, a section of the tones that we have available, and then allowing us to selectively, but it's global, but only affect the shadows by brightening them or darkening them. Actually, what would happen if we brightened the shadows here? Now, Millie's got me thinking, and darken the shadows there. Could be interesting. Kind of opened up the textures a bit. Anyways, yeah. Oh, one other thing to add is that in control points, the control points options here, let's say we place a point on, what's that, camel's hump? And if we move into the basic adjustments, you'll see that there's a shadow slider for the control point, as well as the shadow slider within the selective tones. Now, of course, those algorithms, they're doing the same thing as if they were going to be adjusted globally, except now they would just be affecting the area that the control point is making the selection of. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Eileen is asking, are the photos that you're using RAW, JPEG, or TIFF?
Good question. They're all opened into Photoshop, so they're all a form of a TIFF file, but they're all 16-bit per channel files, and many of them were opened from RAW, right? This was a RAW file as I opened it. This is a RAW file. This is where we get to, you know, use those different color sliders to kind of separate the tones out. And then this was a PSD of a panoramic image, but all 16-bit per channel files. And I would recommend if you're going to make, you know, even moderate brightness, luminance, and color adjustments, to work in a 16-bit per channel file, because one of the things that can happen is you can get what's called stair stepping or like posterization, which especially on an image like this where there's a really fine kind of gradient, especially that goes from these different colors, these warm colors into the cooler colors. It's easy to make an adjustment, not really see that we're getting that stair stepping / posterization, and that can be problematic. It actually literally looks like lines in your image, and simply by working within a 16-bit per channel workflow, you can avoid that most of the time. Yeah. Although one trick, ladies and gentlemen, if you're getting posterization in an image, is you can add a little bit of noise, or jump into Color Effects Pro 4 and add some film grain, and it can help to hide those kinds of posterization problems. Yeah.
Good tip. Okay, Dan, your last question is from John, who's asking, please repeat how to delete a control point.
Yes. All right, let's just take this image right into Viveza. So to delete a control point, you have to first activate the point. I'll show you two ways to delete a control point. Actually, this one works really well with this golden hour preset. I think that's really quite pretty. This is a panoramic image of a view in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. I can't remember exactly where I was standing at the time, but it was a really serene day. So hiding these, placing a control point, and then deleting said control point. So let's say we place a couple points around the image. first things first, if we want to delete a control point, we can click on that control point to activate it, and then we should be able to just tap the delete key on our keyboard, on the computer keyboard, and it'll get rid of it. The first time you do it, a prompt will come up and it'll say, are you sure you want to delete the control point? And what was happening to me was, for some reason, that prompt was coming up behind my Viveza interface. I don't know why that was happening. But here's the other way that you can delete a control point. You can activate it. No matter what, you have to activate the point. So let's say we decide we don't want control point number 1. I'm now over in the right side of the interface under the control points list, and I've activated control point number 1 just by clicking on it within the control points list. You can tap the delete key on your keyboard, or there's a little trash can that's underneath the control points list, and any control point that's active, and when you click on this the trash can, it will just delete it. Yeah, and that's it. I don't think there's another way. I think it's just those are the 2 ways. There's a few different ways of duplicating points, but I think those are the only ways of deleting points.
Okay. Yeah. Great, Dan. Thanks so much. This has been a great presentation. Good little tips along the way too. So appreciate that very much.
Thank you. Yeah, Viveza is an amazingly powerful piece of software. I love this stuff. And you know, Lori, and I know that you're going to do some cleanup there, like some last minute things. I just want to mention that sometimes it's really hard to really see the potential of an image from, you know, the initial capture that might be a little bit linear or flat, or maybe it's perfect right out of capture, and that would be great. But oftentimes it's hard to see the potential. And a tool like Viveza 3, where you can just literally place points and dodge and burn, lighten and darken to figure out what's good and maybe what isn't so great to distract or attract the viewer's attention. You know, it's a lovely way of working. It's easy once you get used to the control points in the interface. It's a fast, very powerful way of working. Anyways, sorry about that, Lori. I kind of interrupted you.
No, that's great. I agree with everything you said. All right. Okay, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope that you took away some good tips here that you can apply to your own images. I want to thank Dan again for a great presentation, and we look forward, Dan, to next month for you joining us again. And we hope that you all will join us as well.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.